When Caleb Boone ordered a bride, he expected youth and obedience. What stepped off that wagon was something far more dangerous. A woman who'd already buried one husband and wasn't about to bury herself. Lydia Hale didn't come to Montana to be saved. She came to prove that a 47-year-old widow could rebuild what this frontier had destroyed. But in a town that measures a woman's worth by her age and her silence, survival isn't just about enduring the land. It's about breaking every rule written against her. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far Lydia's story travels. And if you believe second chances belong to everyone, hit that like button. Now, let's begin. The wagon lurched to a stop outside Boone's trading post, and Caleb felt his jaw tighten before he even saw her. He'd been standing on the platform for 20 minutes, watching dust clouds roll across the valley like smoke signals announcing disaster. The other men had already collected their brides, girls, really, barely past 20, clutching carpet bags and wearing expressions somewhere between hope and terror. That's what he'd expected. That's what the agency had promised. "Mr. Boone?" The voice that cut through the wind wasn't soft or trembling. It was steady, almost formal, like a schoolteacher addressing a pupil who hadn't done his homework. Caleb turned. The woman standing beside the wagon wasn't what desperation looked like. Her traveling dress was plain but well-maintained, dark wool without a single visible mend. Her hair, more silver than brown, was pulled back in a neat coil that hadn't loosened despite 2 days of travel. But it was her eyes that stopped him, pale gray, direct, meeting his without the slightest flinch. She was old, not old the way his mother had been old, worn down by childbirth and prairie winters. This was different. This was a woman who'd already lived a full life somewhere else, who carried herself like she'd forgotten to be ashamed of the years that showed in the fine lines around her mouth and the silver threading through her temples. "You're Mrs. Hale?" The question came out harder than he'd intended. "I am." She didn't smile, didn't apologize for existing. "And you're Caleb Boone. The letter said you'd be here at 3 o'clock. It's 3 o'clock. Behind him, he heard Dutch Morrison cough, a sound that might have been covering a laugh. Caleb didn't turn around. The other men had gathered outside the post, supposedly to collect supplies, but really to get a look at whatever poor woman had answered his advertisement. Now they were getting an eyeful. "How old are you?" The words were out before he could stop them. Something flickered across her face. Not hurt. Irritation, maybe. Old enough to know that's not the first question a gentleman asks a lady. "I'm not a gentleman, and this isn't Boston." "No," she agreed, looking past him at the raw timber buildings and rutted mud that passed for a town. "It certainly isn't." She reached for her trunk, a battered leather thing that had seen better decades. But Caleb grabbed it first, not out of courtesy. Out of the sheer reflexive habit that said you didn't let a woman carry her own luggage, no matter how big a mistake she'd made in coming here. "This way." He started toward the wagon he'd left at the hitching post, not bothering to see if she followed. She did, of course. Her boots made almost no sound on the wooden planks. And when he glanced back, she wasn't hurrying, just walking at her own pace, taking in the town with the kind of calm assessment that made his neck prickle. Dutch fell into step beside him. "Caleb, not now. Just saying, might want to reconsider that temper before—" "I said not now." Caleb heaved the trunk into the wagon bed harder than necessary. The whole frame rattled. When he turned around, Lydia was standing 3 feet away, hands folded in front of her, waiting. "Get in," he said. She looked at the wagon, a working flatbed with a plank seat and no cushions, then back at him. "Is there a hotel in town?" "Why?" "Because I'd like to wash the dust off before we continue this conversation." "There's water at the ranch." "I'm sure there is." Her voice stayed level. "I'm asking about a hotel." "Nearest one's in Stillwater, 20 miles east." He climbed onto the seat and picked up the reins. "You coming or not?" For a moment, he thought she might actually turn around and walk back to the stage depot. Part of him hoped she would. It would save them both the trouble of what came next. But Lydia Hale gathered her skirts, stepped up onto the wheel hub, and settled herself on the far edge of the seat without asking for help. "I'm ready when you are, Mr. Boone." He snapped the reins harder than necessary, and the horses lurched forward. They didn't speak for the first 5 miles. The road, If you could call two ruts through bunch grass a road, cut through open country that had looked beautiful to Caleb once. Back when he'd first claimed this section, when everything had still felt possible. Now it just looked empty. Endless rolling nothing, broken only by the black shapes of cattle scattered across the hills, and the occasional stand of cottonwoods marking where water ran. Lydia sat with her back straight, one hand braced against the seat edge, to steady herself over the rough ground. She didn't complain about the jolting or the dust or the fact that the temperature was dropping fast as the sun sank toward the mountains. She just looked. Caleb found it unnerving. "You got people back east?" he finally asked, more to break the silence than because he cared. "No." "The agency said you were widowed." "I am." "How long?" She was quiet long enough that he thought she might not answer. Then, 3 years. "Kids?" "No." "So you came all the way out here because, what? You got tired of being alone?" Her head turned slightly, and he caught the edge of a look that could have frozen summer. "I came because your advertisement offered a partnership, Mr. Boone. If you're looking for something else, you should have been clear in your letter." Partnership. He let the word hang there. "You know anything about running a ranch?" "I know how to work." "That's not what I asked." "No," she said evenly. "I don't know anything about running a ranch, but I learn quickly. I don't complain, and I keep my promises. If that's not sufficient, you can turn this wagon around right now and take me back to town. I'll wire the agency for return fare and we'll both pretend this was a reasonable misunderstanding." Caleb's hands tightened on the reins. The smart thing, the obvious thing, would be to do exactly that. Cut his losses before this got complicated. But something in her voice stopped him. Not pleading, not desperate, just honest, like she'd already considered the possibility of failure and made her peace with it. "What did your husband do?" he asked instead. "He was a school teacher." Caleb nearly laughed. "And you thought ranch life would suit you?" "I thought," she said carefully, "that perhaps I'd had enough of teaching other people's children and living in other people's houses. I thought I might prefer to build something of my own, even if I had to start late." The ranch came into view as they crested the ridge, a scatter of buildings huddled in the lee of a bluff where a creek cut through. The main house was log and plank built low against the wind. Barn, bunkhouse, corrals. Functional. Nothing pretty about it. Lydia was quiet for a long moment. "How many head?" she finally asked. "Cattle?" "About 300. Had 5 once." He didn't explain why the number had dropped. Didn't mention the drought 2 summers back or the hard winter that followed, or the way everything out here seemed designed to take more than it gave. "And you run it alone?" "Got 2 hands. They're up in the high pasture right now. Won't be back till Saturday." She nodded slowly, still looking at the ranch. "It's isolated." "That a problem?" "No." She turned to face him fully for the first time since they'd left town. "But I need to be clear about something, Mr. Boone. I came here in good faith. I read your letter. I answered honestly. If you've changed your mind because I'm not what you pictured, that's your right. But I won't be treated like a mistake you're too polite to send back. So before we go any further, I need to know, do you want me here or not?" The bluntness of it caught him off guard. Caleb pulled the horses to a stop 50 yards from the house. The wind had picked up, carrying the smell of sage and distance. Somewhere on the ridge, a coyote started its evening song. He looked at Lydia Hale. This woman who was too old, too educated, too obviously out of place for everything this land required, and tried to find the words that would make this make sense. "I'm 43, he said finally. "Been out here 12 years, lost my first wife to fever, lost my daughter the same winter. She was 2. I put that advertisement in the paper because a man can't run a ranch alone forever, and because I'm tired of eating beans out of a can. I didn't ask for much. Just someone willing to work and maybe make this place feel less like a graveyard." Lydia's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes softened, just fractionally. "I didn't expect someone who'd already had a life," he continued. "Someone who probably had real china and books and, I don't know, whatever it is women have when they're not stuck 40 miles from the nearest town." "I had those things," she said quietly. "They didn't keep me warm." The simplicity of it hit him harder than any argument could have. 1 month, he heard himself say. "I'm sorry?" "Give it 1 month. See if you can stand it. End of 30 days, if you want to leave, I'll take you back to town myself. No hard feelings. But if you stay, he stopped, trying to figure out what the end of that sentence should be. If I stay? She prompted. Then we figure it out from there. Lydia considered this for a long moment. Then she held out her hand. 1 month. Agreed. Her grip was firm and cool, and she didn't hold on longer than necessary. Come on, Caleb said, releasing her hand and climbing down from the wagon. I'll show you where you'll be sleeping. The house was worse than she'd imagined. Not filthy. Caleb clearly made some effort to keep the floors swept and the dishes washed, but bare in a way that spoke of years without a woman's touch. The main room held a table, 3 chairs, a wood stove, and not much else. No curtains, no rugs, no pictures on the walls or flowers in jars or any of the small touches that turned a structure into a home. There was exactly 1 bedroom, and Caleb's discomfort was written all over his face as he showed it to her. You take this, he said, standing in the doorway like he might catch something if he came too far inside. I'll bunk in the lean-to off the barn. Lydia looked at the narrow bed, the single bureau, the hooks on the wall where his work shirts hung. That's not necessary. It is till we get this sorted. She turned to face him. Mr. Boone, I'm 47 years old. I was married for 22 years. I'm not scandalized by the existence of bedrooms or the implications thereof, but I appreciate the courtesy. She paused. However, if we're going to be working together, you'll freeze to death in that lean-to come November. Perhaps we should discuss more practical arrangements. Such as? Such as building a second bedroom onto this house. I assume you have lumber. Caleb blinked. You want me to build you a room? I want us to build a room. I can hammer a nail straight. Can you? Despite himself, he almost smiled. Yeah, I can hammer a nail straight. Then that's settled. In the meantime, I'll sleep here and you'll sleep wherever you prefer. But tomorrow we start building. She was already untying her bonnet, setting it on the bureau with the kind of finality that said the conversation was over. Caleb found himself backing toward the door. There's stew on the stove. Not much, but it's hot. Thank you. And if you need anything, I'll manage. She met his eyes again, and there was something almost amused in her expression now. I've been managing for quite some time, Mr. Boone. 1 more night won't kill me. He nodded and retreated, feeling oddly dismissed in his own house. Lydia waited until she heard his boots cross the main room and the door close behind him. Then she sat down on the bed, which creaked but held, and let herself take a full breath for the first time in hours. The journey had been longer and harder than she'd anticipated. The stage from St. Louis to Billings, then the smaller coach to this raw settlement whose name she'd already forgotten. Days of dust and strangers and the constant gnawing question of whether she'd made the worst mistake of her life. And now this. A man who clearly regretted sending for her. A house that looked like it was holding itself together by sheer stubbornness. A landscape so vast and empty, it made her feel like she might blow away if she stepped outside without a tether. She'd left Philadelphia with 2 trunks, a carpet bag, and the last of her savings converted to banknotes sewn into the lining of her corset. Everything she owned in the world fit in those cases. Everything she'd been fit in the parlor of a boarding house that smelled like boiled cabbage and disappointment. After Thomas died, his family had made it clear she wasn't welcome to stay in the house they'd provided during the marriage. A schoolteacher's widow with no children had no claim to their charity. She'd moved from one rented room to another, taking work where she could find it, mending, tutoring, once even scrubbing floors in a hotel when the money ran too low. It was during one of those scrubbing shifts that she'd seen the newspaper someone had left in the lobby. Western Matrimonial News. She'd almost laughed at the title. But curiosity had won, and she'd paged through it while her knees ached against the floorboards. Most of the advertisements had been pathetic. Desperate men looking for housekeepers they could bed without paying wages. But one had been different. Rancher in Montana Territory seeks capable partner for building a life on difficult but beautiful land. Must be honest, hardworking, and willing to endure isolation. Age and appearance less important than character. No drunkards or gossips need apply. She'd read it 3 times before she understood why it resonated. He wasn't looking for a fairy tale. He was looking for someone who could survive. And survival, Lydia knew, was something she'd gotten good at. She'd written the letter that night, mailed it the next morning before she could talk herself out of it. When his reply came, brief, formal, offering passage if she could be in Montana by October, She'd sold what little she had left and bought the ticket. Now here she was. She stood up and moved to the window, looking out at the darkening land. The mountains were black shapes against a sky going purple and gold. The wind rattled the glass in its frame. It was nothing like Philadelphia, nothing like the life she'd known. But Philadelphia had stopped feeling like home the day Thomas died. And this hard, empty place at least had the virtue of being honest about what it demanded. Lydia turned away from the window and started unpacking her trunk. She had a month to prove she belonged here. She intended to use every day of it. Caleb woke before dawn out of habit and found frost on the inside of the lean-to walls. He dressed in the dark, pulling on 2 shirts and his heaviest coat before stepping out into the pre-dawn cold. The sky was just starting to pale at the edges, that deep blue-black that meant another hour before real light. His breath came out in clouds. He'd slept badly, which was his own damn fault for giving up his bed to a stranger. The cot in the lean-to was meant for summer use, not October nights when the temperature dropped toward freezing. But he'd made the offer and he'd stick by it, at least until they got that second room built. If they got it built. If she lasted long enough for it to matter. He fed the horses first, then the chickens, then stood in the barn doorway watching the sky lighten and trying to figure out what the hell he was supposed to do with Lydia Hale. She'd been right about one thing. He'd expected someone different. Younger, obviously, but also malleable. Someone who'd be grateful for the chance at a new life, who'd fit herself into whatever shape this place required. Someone who needed him. Lydia Hale didn't need anybody. That much was already clear, and it bothered him more than it should. When he finally went back to the house, smoke was rising from the chimney and he could smell coffee. He found her in the kitchen, fully dressed, her hair already pinned up, stirring something in a pot on the stove. She'd found his spare apron and tied it over her dark dress. "Morning," she said without turning around. "You're up early." "Habit. I assume you eat breakfast." "When there's time." "There's always time to eat." She ladled something into a bowl and set it on the table. "Sit." It was porridge, plain but hot, and she'd managed to find the brown sugar he kept in the back of the cupboard. There was coffee, too, stronger than he usually made it. Caleb sat. Lydia fixed her own bowl and joined him, taking the chair across the table. For a few minutes, they ate in silence. "I looked through the pantry," she said finally. "You're low on flour, almost out of salt, and unless I'm mistaken, those potatoes in the bin are starting to sprout. I was planning to go into town next week. Sooner would be better. Winter's coming." He looked up. "You've been here one night and you're already telling me how to run my supplies?" "I'm observing what needs doing. Isn't that what you wanted? Someone who could help?" "Helping's one thing, taking over's another." Lydia set down her spoon. "Mr. Boone, I'm not interested in taking over anything, but I've been managing households for 22 years, and I can see when stores are running low. If you'd prefer I keep my observations to myself, I will, but it seems counterproductive." She was right, and they both knew it, which only irritated him more. "Fine," he said. "We'll go into town tomorrow, get what we need." "Thank you." They finished eating in silence. When Lydia stood to clear the dishes, Caleb stopped her. "Leave them. We've got work to do." "What kind of work?" "You said you wanted to build a room. Time to see if you meant it." They spent the morning measuring and marking where the new bedroom would go. An extension off the east side of the house where it would catch the morning sun but stay sheltered from the worst of the west wind. Lydia worked without complaint, holding the measuring tape when he needed it, marking boards when he told her where to cut. She didn't know the terminology and had to ask what a header was, what he meant by studs, how the frame would connect to the existing structure. But she asked clearly, remembered the answers, and didn't need to be told twice. By midday, they had the foundation posts set and the first floor beams laid out. "We'll frame it tomorrow," Caleb said, wiping sweat off his forehead despite the cold. "Get the walls up before the weather turns." Lydia nodded, looking at what they'd accomplished. Her dress was dusty, and her hands were red from the cold, but she didn't seem bothered by either. "You've done this before," she observed. "Built rooms?" "Yeah." "The whole house?" "Most of it. Had help with the barn." He paused. "My wife wanted a bigger place. I was working on it when she got sick." Lydia looked at him for a long moment. "I'm sorry. It was a long time ago." "That doesn't make it easier." No, he thought. It really didn't. They walked back to the house for lunch, cold biscuits and the last of yesterday's stew. Lydia heated it without being asked, served it without ceremony. Can you ride? Caleb asked halfway through the meal. She looked up, surprised. A horse? No, a buffalo. Yes, a horse. I can sit on one without falling off, if that's what you're asking. Good enough. This afternoon I need to check the cattle in the south pasture. You can come with me, see what the ranch looks like beyond the house. All right. Wear something warmer. And boots if you've got them. The good kind, not those. He gestured at her feet, where she wore the kind of leather shoes women wore to church. I have boots, she said evenly. I'll change. The horse Caleb saddled for her was a gray mare with a patient eye. Her name's Dolly. She's old and slow and won't do anything stupid. Just stay behind me and you'll be fine. Lydia mounted with the awkwardness of someone who'd done it before, but not recently. She settled into the saddle, found the stirrups, and nodded. They rode south into country that looked empty until you knew how to read it. The grass was yellowing, autumn dry, and the cattle were scattered across the rolling hills in groups of 3 and 4. Caleb counted them automatically, a lifetime habit of making sure nothing had wandered off or gotten taken by wolves. How much land do you have? Lydia asked from behind him. 1,600 acres, most of it's open range. That's large. Out here it's medium. You need a lot of grass per head. Land doesn't give much. They rode in silence for a while. Caleb checked a few head up close, making sure they looked healthy, no signs of injury or disease. Everything seemed fine. Quiet. The kind of day when you could almost forget how hard this life was. Mr. Boone, Lydia said eventually, can I ask you something? Depends on the question. Why did you really send for a wife? And don't tell me it was just about the cooking. He kept his eyes forward. I told you yesterday. You told me you were tired of being alone, but that's not the whole truth, is it? Caleb was quiet for a long time, then, no, it's not. So what is? He pulled his horse to a stop and turned to look at her. Lydia sat on old Dolly with her back straight and her expression open, waiting. I'm getting older, he said finally. The work doesn't get easier and the winters don't get warmer. I look at this place and I think, what's it all for? When I die, who gets it? Who cares what I built here? He stopped, surprised at himself for saying it out loud. I thought maybe if I had someone, it wouldn't feel so pointless. Lydia's face softened. It's not pointless. You don't know that. Yes, I do. She gestured at the land around them. You've built something real here, something that lasts. That's more than most people ever do. It's just dirt and grass and stubborn cattle. It's a life, Mr. Boone. And life is never pointless, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. He wanted to argue with her, wanted to tell her she didn't understand, that she was new here and naive and hadn't seen enough of this place to know what it took from you. But the way she looked at him stopped the words in his throat. Because Lydia Hale, he realized, understood exactly what it felt like to build a life only to watch it crumble. Come on, he said roughly, turning his horse. We're losing daylight. They rode back to the ranch as the sun dropped toward the mountains, turning the whole sky orange and gold. The temperature plummeted with the light, and by the time they reached the barn, Lydia was shivering. Go inside, Caleb told her. Get warm. I'll put the horses up. For once, she didn't argue. That night, Lydia made dinner from what little they had. Beans, the last of the bacon, cornbread that was heavy but edible. They ate at the table while the wind howled outside and the stove ticked as the fire burned down. Tomorrow we go into town, Caleb said. Get those supplies you mentioned, and lumber for the room. All right? Might take most of the day. That's fine. He looked at her across the table. You did all right today. Lydia raised an eyebrow. Is that a compliment, Mr. Boone? It's an observation. I see. But there was the faintest hint of a smile at the corner of her mouth. Then allow me to make one as well. You're a better teacher than you think you are. I didn't teach you anything. You showed me your land. You explained why things matter. You didn't treat me like I was stupid for not knowing. She paused. That's teaching, whether you call it that or not. Caleb didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. They cleaned up together in silence, and when Lydia went to the bedroom and closed the door, he stood in the empty main room for a long time, listening to the wind and trying to figure out what he'd gotten himself into. 1 month, he'd said. 30 days. He had a feeling it was going to be the longest month of his life. The ride into town started badly and got worse. Caleb had the wagon loaded and ready by first light, but Lydia came out of the house wearing the same traveling dress she'd arrived in. Dark wool, practical enough, but already showing dust at the hem. She climbed up onto the seat without help, settling her skirts around her like she was heading to Sunday service instead of a frontier trading post. The first mile passed in silence, then the second. By the third, Caleb's jaw was so tight it ached. "You planning to talk at all today?" he finally asked. Lydia glanced at him. "I wasn't aware conversation was required." "It's not, but it makes the time pass." "Very well. What would you like to discuss?" "I don't know. Anything. The weather, the ranch, whatever women talk about." Her mouth twitched. "Mr. Boone, if you think women spend their time discussing whatever, you have a limited understanding of half the human population." Despite himself, he almost smiled. "Fine. What do you want to talk about?" "I'd like to know what we're buying today. You mentioned lumber, but how much? And what about the supplies I noted yesterday? Do you have a list, or are we simply hoping to remember everything once we arrive?" Caleb pulled a piece of paper from his pocket and handed it over. "Already made it." Lydia unfolded it and scanned the contents. Her eyebrows rose. "This is quite thorough. I've done this before." "I can see that." She studied the list more carefully. "You've included fabric. Figured you'd want curtains or something. Make the place less..." He gestured vaguely. "Bleak?" "I was going to say plain. Bleak is more accurate." But there was no judgment in her voice, just observation. "Thank you. That's thoughtful." The word caught him off guard. When was the last time anyone had called him thoughtful? They crested a rise and the town came into view, a scattered collection of buildings huddled around a main street that turned to soup when it rained. It looked even smaller in daylight than Caleb remembered, which was saying something. "That's it?" Lydia asked. "That's it. Trading post, saloon, land office, blacksmith. There's a church but no preacher. Closest doctor's in Stillwater. And the population? Maybe 40 people if you count everyone within 10 miles. Doubles on Saturday when the ranchers come in." Lydia was quiet for a moment. "It's very isolated. That's Montana. I'm beginning to understand that." They pulled up outside Boone's trading post, which despite the name hadn't been owned by anyone in Caleb's family for 20 years. The current owner was a man named Garrett Webb, who'd come west after the war and never quite figured out how to leave. The bell over the door jangled as they entered. Garrett looked up from behind the counter, his expression shifting from bored to curious when he saw Lydia. "Caleb, didn't expect you till next week." "Plans changed. Need supplies." He handed over the list. "And lumber. Enough to frame out a 12 by 14 room." Garrett's eyes flicked to Lydia, then back to Caleb. "Building something new?" "Adding on to the house." "That's so." Garrett's tone was carefully neutral, but Caleb could see the question stacking up behind his eyes. "Guess you'll be wanting that loaded up while I gather the rest." "That'd be helpful." Garrett nodded slowly, still looking at Lydia like he was trying to solve a puzzle. "Ma'am?" "Mr. Webb," Lydia said evenly. "You settling in all right?" "Well enough, thank you." The silence stretched just long enough to get uncomfortable. Then Garrett cleared his throat and turned back to the list. "Give me about an hour to get this together. You folks need anything else while you wait?" "We're fine," Caleb said. They stepped back outside into the cold morning air. Across the street, 2 women were standing in front of the dry goods store, both of them staring. When they saw Caleb looking, they turned away and started whispering. "Subtle," Lydia murmured. "Small towns are all the same. Everyone knows everyone's business before it happens." "I'm familiar with the concept." She adjusted her shawl. "Shall we walk, or would you prefer to stand here and give them more to speculate about?" Caleb found himself grinning despite his mood. "Come on. I'll show you the rest of the metropolis." The grand tour took 10 minutes. Lydia looked at everything with the same calm assessment she'd given the ranch, noting details, asking occasional questions showing neither approval nor disappointment. When they passed the saloon, 3 men were standing outside smoking. They stopped talking when they saw her. "Morning, Caleb," one of them called out. That the new Mrs.? Mrs. Hale, Caleb said shortly. Ma'am? The man tipped his hat, but his eyes were doing calculations that made Caleb's fists clench. Pleasure to meet you. Lydia nodded politely and kept walking. When they were out of earshot, she said quietly, Is it always like this? Like what? People staring, measuring, trying to decide if I'm suitable. Caleb stopped walking. You want the truth? Always. It'll get worse before it gets better. You're new, you're different, and you're not what anyone expected. That makes you interesting. Give it a few weeks and they'll move on to something else. And if they don't? Then to hell with them. The words came out harder than he'd intended. I don't care what this town thinks. Neither should you. Lydia looked at him for a long moment. That's very democratic of you, Mr. Boone, but you're not the one they're whispering about. No, I'm just the fool who sent for a mail-order bride at 43. Is that what they call you? Among other things. To his surprise, she laughed, a short, dry sound. Then we make quite a pair, don't we? The fool and the spinster. You're not a spinster. You were married. Widowed at 47 amounts to the same thing in most people's eyes. She started walking again. But I stopped caring what most people thought a long time ago. I suggest you do the same. Caleb caught up with her. You always this blunt? Would you prefer I lie? No? Then yes, I'm always this blunt. I find it saves time. They made it back to the trading post just as Garrett was finishing loading the wagon. The lumber was stacked in the bed, supplies packed in crates around it. Everything on the list, plus a few extras Garrett had thrown in. Should hold you through winter if you're careful, Garrett said, wiping his hands on his apron. That'll be $42. Caleb counted out the money without comment. $42 was most of what he'd saved this month, but supplies were supplies. You didn't skimp on necessities, not out here. Garrett took the bills and made them disappear into his cash box. You folks need anything else? You know where to find me. Appreciate it. They were halfway to the wagon when a woman's voice called out behind them. Caleb Boone, you stop right there. Caleb closed his eyes briefly. He'd been hoping to avoid this. He turned. Margaret Fletcher was crossing the street toward them, her face set in the expression of determined concern that usually preceded unwanted advice. She was the doctor's wife from Stillwater, in town visiting her sister, and she'd made it her personal mission to know everyone's business within a 50-mile radius. Margaret. Don't you Margaret me. I heard you'd gone and done something foolish, but I didn't believe it until I saw for myself. She turned to Lydia, looking her up and down with the kind of thoroughness usually reserved for livestock auctions. So you're the one. I'm Lydia Hale, Lydia said, her voice perfectly level. And you are? Margaret Fletcher. My husband's the doctor in Stillwater. She turned back to Caleb. Honestly, Caleb, what were you thinking? A woman her age all the way out here? It's not appropriate. Appropriate for what? Caleb asked. For any number of things. The work, for one. The isolation, She lowered her voice. The expectations of marriage. Caleb felt heat climb up his neck. Mrs. Fletcher, with all due respect. I'm 47, not elderly, Lydia interrupted, her tone still calm but with an edge underneath. I can work a full day without collapsing. I can endure isolation better than most people half my age. And as for the expectations of marriage, I was married for 22 years. I'm quite familiar with what's expected. Margaret's mouth opened and closed like a fish. Well, I was simply trying to be helpful. Were you? Lydia tilted her head slightly. Because it sounded more like you were questioning my fitness for a life I've already chosen, which, while perhaps well-intentioned, is neither helpful nor appreciated. The silence that followed could have frozen water. Good day, Mrs. Fletcher, Lydia said pleasantly, and turned toward the wagon. Caleb followed, fighting the urge to laugh. Behind them, he could hear Margaret sputtering something to her sister, but the words were lost in the wind. That was something, he said when they were out of earshot. That was a busybody who needed to be reminded of her place. Lydia climbed into the wagon with more force than strictly necessary. I will not be pitied, Mr. Boone. Not by strangers, not by neighbors, not by anyone. Noted. Good. They rode in silence for the first mile out of town. Then Caleb said, For what it's worth, You handled that well. Lydia glanced at him. Did I? Margaret Fletcher's been running roughshod over this county for 10 years. Nobody talks back to her. Then perhaps someone should have started sooner. This time Caleb did laugh. You're going to be trouble, aren't you? I suspect so. But the corner of her mouth twitched. Will that be a problem? Ask me in 30 days. The ride back to the ranch took longer than the ride in, the wagon heavy with lumber and supplies. By the time they arrived, the sun was past its peak and the temperature was dropping fast. Caleb pulled up near the house and started unloading. I'll help, Lydia said, climbing down. It's heavy work. So is everything else out here? Show me what goes where. They worked for the next hour, carrying supplies into the house and stacking lumber near the construction site. Lydia didn't complain when the crates were heavier than expected or when splinters caught in her gloves. She just kept working, steady and methodical, until everything was unloaded and sorted. When they finally stopped, she was breathing hard and her face was flushed from the cold and exertion. Go inside, Caleb said. Warm up. I'll put the wagon away and feed the stock. I can help with that too. I know you can, but you've done enough for today. For once, she didn't argue, just nodded and headed toward the house, moving a little more slowly than usual. Caleb watched her go, then turned to the horses. His hands were cold and his back ached, but there was something oddly satisfying about the day's work. They'd gotten what they needed. They'd stood up to the town's gossip. And Lydia Hale had proven, again, that she wasn't going to fold just because things got difficult. 1 week down, 3 to go. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the kind of October day that promised winter wasn't far behind. Caleb woke before dawn in the lean-to, his breath visible in the air, and lay there for a moment trying to convince his body that getting up was a good idea. When he finally made it to the house, Lydia was already in the kitchen, coffee brewing and something that smelled like bacon frying in the pan. Morning, she said without turning around. You keep getting up this early. You're going to wear yourself out. I've been getting up at 5 o'clock for 30 years, Mr. Boone. I'm not going to stop now. She flipped the bacon. Besides, someone needs to make sure you eat a proper breakfast. I eat fine. You eat what's available, which isn't the same thing. She set a plate in front of him, bacon, eggs, and the last of the cornbread from 2 nights ago, toasted over the fire. Sit. Caleb sat. The food was good, better than good actually, considering what she had to work with. He was halfway through when he noticed Lydia wasn't eating. You going to join me? I already ate. When? Before you woke up. He set down his fork. Mrs. Hale, we need to get something straight. You don't have to wait on me like I'm some kind of... I'm not waiting on you. I'm feeding you. There's a difference. She poured herself coffee and sat down across from him. In my experience, men who work with their hands need fuel. You can't frame a room on an empty stomach. Is that what we're doing today? Unless you had other plans. Caleb looked at her over his coffee cup. She was wearing a different dress today. Still dark, still practical, but this one was older. The kind of thing you wore when you knew you'd be getting dirty. Her hair was already pinned up, and there was a determination in her eyes that he was starting to recognize. No other plans, he said. Let's build your room. They worked through the morning in the kind of focused silence that comes when two people are learning each other's rhythms. Caleb would measure and mark. Lydia would hold board steady while he nailed. She learned quickly which tools were which, stopped asking questions she could figure out herself, and never once complained about the cold or the repetitive nature of the work. By midday, they had the wall frames up and braced. The structure was starting to take shape. You could see where the room would be, how it would connect to the house, where the window would go. It's bigger than I expected, Lydia said, stepping back to look at it. 12 by 14, same as the other bedroom. Caleb wiped sweat off his forehead. You'll have space for a real bed, maybe a dresser and a chair. That's generous? It's practical. You can't live out of a trunk forever. They broke for lunch, cold ham and bread, eaten standing up because neither of them wanted to lose momentum. The sky had turned gray while they worked, and the wind was picking up from the north. Storm coming, Caleb observed. Lydia looked at the clouds. How long? Tonight, maybe tomorrow morning. We should get the roof framed before it hits. Then let's keep working. They pushed through the afternoon, racing the weather. The temperature dropped with every hour, and by the time they got the last roof beam in place, Lydia's hands were shaking from cold and fatigue. "That's enough," Caleb said, hammering in the final nail. "We'll tarp it for tonight. Finish the rest when the storm passes." "Are you sure we could?" "I'm sure. Come on." They secured the tarpaulin over the unfinished roof just as the first drops of rain began to fall. By the time they made it inside, the sky had opened up completely. Caleb built up the fire while Lydia peeled off her damp shawl and hung it by the stove. She was moving stiffly now, exhaustion catching up with her. "You should rest," he said. "I should make dinner." I can make dinner. Sit down before you fall down." For once, she didn't argue, just sank into one of the chairs and closed her eyes. Caleb put together a simple meal, more of the stew he'd been eating all week, heated over the fire. When he set a bowl in front of Lydia, she opened her eyes and gave him a tired smile. "Thank you. Don't mention it." They ate while the storm hammered against the walls and the wind howled down the chimney. It was the kind of weather that made you grateful for 4 walls and a roof, even if one of those walls was still half finished. "Tell me something," Lydia said eventually. "What?" "About your wife, your first wife." Caleb went still. "Why?" "Because she lived here before me, because this was her house, her life, and because I'd like to understand what I'm stepping into." He was quiet for a long time. The fire crackled. Rain drummed on the roof. "Her name was Sarah," he finally said. "We met in St. Louis. She was young, 19 when we married, pretty, sweet. She wanted adventure, or thought she did. Came out here with me when I first claimed the land." He stopped, staring into his bowl. "She hated it, hated the isolation, hated the work, hated being so far from civilization, but she tried. I'll give her that. She tried hard." "What happened?" "Fever. Winter of '72. There was nothing the doctor could do, and by the time we got her to Stillwater, it was too late anyway." His voice had gone flat. "Our daughter caught it too. Emma. She was 2 years old, died 3 days after Sarah." Lydia's hand moved across the table, stopping just short of his. "I'm sorry." "Long time ago." "That doesn't make it easier." No, Caleb thought, it really didn't. "What about your husband?" he asked, needing to shift the weight of the conversation. Lydia withdrew her hand. "Thomas, we met when I was 23, later than most women married, but my father was particular about suitors. Thomas taught at the academy where my father was headmaster, literature and rhetoric." A faint smile. "He had a beautiful voice, could recite entire sonnets from memory." "Sounds impressive." It was. At first. The smile faded. But Thomas lived in his head. Books and ideas were more real to him than the world around him. He forgot to pay bills, forgot to eat sometimes. I spent 22 years managing everything while he wandered around quoting Shakespeare. "You loved him anyway." "I did. Not in the way young girls dream about, all passion and poetry, but steadily, quietly. He was a good man, even if he wasn't always a practical one." She paused. "He died in his sleep. Heart simply stopped. The doctor said it was quick, that he didn't suffer. I'm not sure that made it easier." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the storm. "We're a pair, aren't we?" Caleb said eventually. "How do you mean?" "Both of us trying to build something new out of pieces that don't quite fit." Lydia considered this. "Perhaps. Or perhaps we're both just stubborn enough to try anyway. Maybe that's the same thing. Maybe it is." The storm lasted through the night and into the next morning, keeping them housebound. Caleb spent the time doing small repairs, fixing a loose hinge, patching a crack in the window frame. Lydia reorganized the pantry, took inventory of what they'd bought, and started a list of what they'd need before winter truly set in. They worked around each other in the small space, learning to anticipate movements, to stay out of each other's way. It should have been awkward, 2 near strangers forced into close quarters, but somehow it wasn't. By the second afternoon, the rain had slowed to a drizzle and Caleb was getting restless. "I need to check the stock," he said, pulling on his coat. "Make sure the roof didn't blow off the barn." "I'll come with you." "You don't need to. It's wet and cold and I'm going anyway." Lydia was already wrapping her shawl around her shoulders. "I'd like to see the barn properly, and the animals. Caleb opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. There was no point. The barn was in better shape than he'd expected. A few shingles loose, but nothing serious. The horses were dry, and the chickens were huddled in their roost, looking annoyed at the weather, but otherwise fine. Lydia walked through slowly, taking in the layout. You keep it clean. Can't afford to let things get slovenly. Disease spreads fast in dirty quarters. She ran her hand along one of the stalls. We'll need more hay before long. Already arranged. Garrett's supposed to have it delivered next week. Good. She moved to where the milk cow was penned. Does she have a name? Bessie. Original, I know. Lydia smiled and reached through the rails to scratch the cow's head. Hello, Bessie. You're a patient girl, aren't you? The cow leaned into the touch, and Caleb found himself watching the interaction with something he couldn't quite name. Lydia's hands were gentle, her voice soft. The cow responded to her like she'd been handling livestock all her life. You ever milk a cow? He asked. No, but I'm willing to learn. I'll teach you tomorrow. It's not hard, just takes practice. All right. They stood there in the dimness of the barn, rain pattering on the roof, the smell of hay and animals thick in the air. Outside, the world was gray and cold and unwelcoming. But in here, there was warmth and the simple comfort of work that mattered. Mr. Boone, Lydia said quietly. Yeah? Thank you for giving me this chance. I know I'm not what you wanted, but I'm grateful anyway. Caleb looked at her. This woman who'd upended his careful plans, who worked without complaint and spoke her mind and refused to be anything other than exactly who she was. You're doing fine, he said. Which wasn't what he meant, but it was as close as he could get to the truth without saying more than he was ready to admit. They walked back to the house through the drizzle, neither one speaking, and Caleb thought about what she'd said, about being grateful. He wasn't sure yet if he was grateful or terrified, but he was starting to suspect it might be both. The third week started with frost thick enough to crunch underfoot and a sky so clear it hurt to look at. Caleb woke in the lean-to to find ice crystals on the inside of the walls and his breath forming clouds that hung in the still air. Winter was coming early this year. He could feel it in his bones. When he made it to the house, Lydia had breakfast ready and the new room nearly finished. They'd worked on it every spare hour for the past 10 days, and now it had walls, a roof, a door that hung straight, and a window that faced east just like she'd wanted. All that remained was the interior work, plastering the walls, building a bed frame, making it livable. We should move you in today, Caleb said, warming his hands around a cup of coffee. Get you out of my room before the real cold sets in. It's not your room anymore, Lydia pointed out. You haven't slept in there since I arrived. Still feels like mine. Well, it shouldn't. She set a plate of eggs and salt pork in front of him. But I agree about moving. The sooner I'm settled, the sooner you can stop freezing in that shed. Lean-to. Shed. She sat down across from him with her own breakfast. Be honest, Mr. Boone, how much longer can you last out there? He wanted to say indefinitely out of pure stubbornness. But the truth was, his back had been aching for days, and he'd woken up this morning with his fingers so stiff he could barely make a fist. Long enough, he said instead. That's not an answer. It's the only one you're getting. Lydia shook her head but didn't push. They ate in the comfortable silence that had developed between them, not the awkward quiet of strangers, but the easy rhythm of people who'd learned to work together. After breakfast, they spent the morning moving Lydia's belongings into the new room. It didn't take long, 2 trunks, a carpet bag, and a wooden box that turned out to be full of books. Caleb lifted the box and nearly dropped it. What's in here, Rox? Literature, philosophy, some poetry. She said it matter-of-factly, like everyone traveled with 50 pounds of books. I couldn't leave them behind. He carried the box into the room and set it down carefully. Through the window, morning light slanted across the bare floor, catching dust motes in the air. The space smelled like fresh-cut lumber and possibility. It's a good room, Lydia said from the doorway. It'll do. It's more than that. She walked in, running her hand along the wall. You built this well, strong. It'll last. Caleb felt something shift in his chest at the quiet approval in her voice. We built it. You helped. I held boards and handed you nails. You did the real work. Real work is showing up every day and not quitting when your hands are cold and your back hurts. You did that just fine. They looked at each other across the empty room, and for a moment something hung in the air between them. Acknowledgement, maybe, or the beginning of respect. Then Lydia smiled slightly and the moment passed. "I'll need a bed," she said practically, "unless you expect me to sleep on the floor." "Already thought of that. There's lumber left over. I can frame something up this afternoon." "I'll help." "You always help." "That's the arrangement, isn't it? Partnership." The word partnership had stopped sounding strange. Somewhere over the past 2 weeks, it had become simply fact. They worked through midday, building a simple bed frame in the corner of the room. Caleb showed Lydia how to fit the joints properly, how to make sure everything was square and level. She learned quickly, her hands becoming more confident with the tools, her questions becoming more precise. By late afternoon, they had a functional bed frame with rope supports for a mattress. "I've got an extra tick in the barn," Caleb said, testing the frame's stability. "We can stuff it with fresh straw. Won't be fancy, but it'll be warm." "Warm is all I need." They filled the tick together, working in the barn while the temperature dropped outside. The straw smelled sweet and dry, and by the time they'd finished, the mattress was thick enough to be comfortable. Carrying it back to the house, Caleb caught sight of dark clouds building over the western mountains. They were still distant, but moving fast. "Storm tonight," he said. Lydia followed his gaze. "Bad?" "Hard to say, but we should get the stock secured just in case." They spent the next hour making preparations, bringing extra hay into the barn, making sure the chicken coop was latched tight, checking that the horses had enough water. It was routine work, the kind Caleb had done 1,000 times before, but having Lydia there made it different. She anticipated what needed doing without being told, worked without complaining about the cold, and when they finally made it back inside as the first snow began to fall, she looked tired but satisfied. "First snow," she observed, brushing flakes from her shawl. "Won't be the last." "I know." She moved to the window, watching the white begin to accumulate on the ground. "It's beautiful, though. In Philadelphia, snow just turned to gray slush within hours. Here it stays clean." "Give it time. You'll get tired of it." "Perhaps." But she didn't sound convinced. That night the storm hit hard. Wind screamed around the corners of the house, driving snow horizontal across the windows. The temperature plummeted. Caleb built up the fire in the stove and hung blankets over the windows to keep the cold out. But even so, the house felt like it might shake apart. Lydia emerged from her new room wearing a heavy shawl over her nightdress, her hair down for the first time since Caleb had met her. It fell past her shoulders, more gray than brown in the firelight. "Can't sleep?" he asked. "The wind's too loud." She moved closer to the stove. "Is it always like this?" "Sometimes worse." She was quiet for a moment, listening to the storm rage outside. Then, quietly, "Thomas died in weather like this. Not snow, rain, but the same kind of violence in it." Caleb looked up from the fire. "You don't have to talk about it." "I know, but I think I want to." She sat down in one of the chairs, pulling the shawl tighter. It was March. He'd gone to visit a colleague in the next town over, just a day trip. But a storm came through, worse than anyone expected. The bridge he was crossing washed out. They found him 2 miles downstream 3 days later. "I'm sorry. I was angry for a long time. Angry at him for going, angry at the weather, angry at myself for not stopping him." She looked at the fire. "But anger doesn't change anything. He was still gone, and I was still alone." Outside, the wind howled like something alive. "That's why you came here, isn't it?" Caleb said. "Not because you wanted to. Because you couldn't stand to stay where you were." Lydia met his eyes. "Yes. Every street reminded me of him. Every room. I'd wake up expecting to hear him downstairs reciting poetry to himself while he made coffee, and then I'd remember he was dead and the silence was just silence." She paused. "So when I saw your advertisement, I thought, why not? Why not go somewhere where there are no memories, where I can be someone other than Thomas Hale's widow?" "And? Is it working?" She considered the question seriously. "I don't know yet. Ask me when the month is over." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the storm. The fire crackled. The wind threw snow against the walls. And somewhere in the darkness, the ranch held together against the violence of the weather, the same way it had held together through every storm before this one. "You should try to sleep," Caleb said eventually. "Morning comes early." "So should you." "I will. Just want to make sure the fire stays going." Lydia stood, but hesitated at the doorway to her room. Mr. Boone? Yeah? Thank you for listening. Nothing to thank me for. There is, but you're too stubborn to hear it. She smiled slightly. Good night. Good night. Caleb sat alone by the fire for another hour, thinking about death and memory and the ways people carried their grief. When he finally made it out to the lean-to, the cold hit him like a fist. He lay under every blanket he owned and listened to the storm tear at the world outside. Tomorrow, he thought. Tomorrow he'd move back into the house, into the old bedroom. There was no point freezing to death out of misplaced pride. Tomorrow. The storm blew itself out by morning, leaving the world buried under 8 inches of fresh snow. Caleb woke stiff and cold, his breath visible even under the blankets. When he finally forced himself upright, pain shot through his lower back, and his hands were so numb he couldn't feel his fingers. He made it to the house, moving like an old man, every step an exercise in stubborn determination. Lydia took one look at him and pointed at a chair. Sit. I'm fine. You're half frozen, and you can barely walk. Sit down before you fall down. He sat. She brought him coffee, strong enough to strip paint, and stood over him while he drank it. When color started coming back to his face, she finally spoke. This is ridiculous. What is? You, sleeping in that shed. It's November. The real cold hasn't even started yet. She crossed her arms. Move back into the house. We've been over this, and we're going over it again. There are 2 bedrooms now. You take the old one, I have the new one. It's practical, it's sensible, and it keeps you from dying of exposure like an idiot. People will talk. People are already talking. They've been talking since I got off that wagon. I don't care what they think, and neither should you. Caleb wanted to argue, but his entire body was screaming at him that she was right. Another week in the lean-to, and he'd be useless for work. Another month, and he might not survive. Fine, he said. I'll move my things today. Good. She turned back to the stove. Now eat something. You look terrible. By mid-morning, Caleb had moved his few possessions back into the old bedroom. It felt strange being there again, the room where Sarah had died, where he'd spent years alone. But it also felt right in a way he couldn't quite explain, like coming home after a long absence. Lydia was in the kitchen when he came out, kneading dough for bread. Her sleeves were rolled up, and there was flour on her hands and forearms. Better? She asked without looking up. Better. You'll need firewood brought in, and the path to the barn should be cleared before the snow gets packed down. Yes, ma'am. She did look up at that, one eyebrow raised. Are you mocking me? No, ma'am. You're impossible. So I've been told. But he was smiling when he went outside, and he could have sworn he saw her smile too. The next week fell into a new rhythm. Mornings started early with chores, feeding stock, milking Bessie, gathering eggs from chickens who were increasingly annoyed about the cold. Lydia learned to milk the cow with surprising efficiency, her hands learning the rhythm quickly despite initial clumsiness. You're getting good at this, Caleb observed one morning, watching her work. It's not complicated once you understand the principle. She leaned her head against Bessie's flank, her hands moving steadily. Just pressure and release, like everything else in life. That's one way to look at it. What's your way? Hold on tight and hope nothing breaks. Lydia laughed. A real laugh. The kind he hadn't heard from her before. That's remarkably pessimistic, Mr. Boone. That's remarkably realistic. They worked together easily now, the initial awkwardness burned away by shared labor and proximity. Caleb found himself talking more than he had in years, pointing out landmarks when they rode the fence line, explaining the logic behind how he managed the herd, telling stories about the early days when he'd first claimed this land and everything was still possible. Lydia listened more than she spoke, but when she did talk, her observations were sharp and practical. She noticed things he'd stopped seeing. A loose board on the barn that needed fixing, a place where water was pooling that would turn to ice, patterns in the cattle's behavior that suggested they needed salt. You see things, he said one afternoon as they mended fence. Everyone sees things. Not like you. You look at something and understand how it works, what it needs. She was quiet for a moment, holding wire tight while he twisted it into place. That's what teachers do. We look at what's in front of us and figure out what's missing. You miss it, teaching? Sometimes I miss the children, the way their faces would light up when they finally understood something difficult. She paused. But I don't miss living in other people's spaces. Always grateful, always provisional. This is different. How? This is mine, or could be if I stay. She looked at him directly. If you let me stay. The month was almost over. 3 more days and their agreement would be done. She could leave. He could release her from whatever obligation she felt. They could both go back to being alone. The thought sat in his chest like a stone. We should talk about that, he said. Not yet. Her voice was firm. 3 more days, then we talk. That night, the temperature dropped below 0 for the first time. Caleb woke to the sound of something breaking, a sharp crack that brought him upright in bed, heart pounding. He pulled on his boots and coat and went outside into darkness so cold it burned his lungs. The moon was up, bright enough to see by, and the world was frozen solid under its light. The sound had come from the barn. He could see it now. One of the roof beams had split under the weight of accumulated ice, sagging dangerously over the stalls where the horses were kept. Damn it! He heard the house door open behind him. Lydia appeared, wrapped in her heavy shawl, her breath forming clouds. What happened? Roof beam cracked. If it goes, it'll come down on the horses. She looked at the barn, at the dangerous angle of the sagging timber. What do you need? Help bracing it until I can get a replacement in place. But it's dangerous. If it goes while we're under it, then we'd better work quickly. She was already moving toward the barn. Tell me what to do. They worked by lamplight in the freezing barn, Caleb up in the rafters trying to shore up the cracked beam while Lydia held the brace in place from below. The horses were restless, sensing danger, and every few seconds the beam would creak and Caleb's heart would stop. Little more to the left, he called down. Lydia adjusted her position, arms shaking from the effort of holding the heavy timber. Like this? Perfect. Hold it steady. He worked as fast as his frozen fingers allowed, driving nails through the brace and into solid wood. Twice the beam shifted and he thought it would go. Twice Lydia held it in place through sheer will. When he finally hammered in the last nail and the structure held, he climbed down to find Lydia leaning against the stall, breathing hard. You all right? He asked. Fine, just cold. He looked at her more carefully. Her face was pale and her hands were trembling, not from exertion, but from something else. You're scared. Of course I'm scared. Her voice was tight. That beam could have killed you, could have killed both of us. And for what? Horses that would have probably been fine if we just moved them? They would have been crushed if that beam fell. Maybe, maybe not. But you went up there anyway. You risked your life anyway. She pushed away from the stall, agitated now. Do you have any idea how foolish that was? Caleb stared at her, trying to understand where this was coming from. Lydia, don't. Just don't. She wrapped her arms around herself. I watched my husband die because he made a foolish choice, because he thought crossing a swollen river was worth the risk. I won't watch it happen again. Understanding hit him like cold water. This isn't about the beam. No, it's not. She met his eyes, and he could see the fear there now, raw and honest. It's about you not understanding that some things aren't worth dying for. The horses are animals, Mr. Boone. Valuable, yes. Important, yes. But not worth your life. Not worth— She stopped, looking away. Not worth what? She was quiet for a long time. The horses shifted in their stalls, the lamp flickered. Not worth making me care, she said finally, so quietly he almost didn't hear it. I came here to escape grief, not to risk it all over again. The words hung between them in the frozen air. Caleb took a step closer. Lydia. The month is almost over, she interrupted. 3 more days and I can leave. Go somewhere safer, somewhere I don't have to worry about beams falling or storms coming or men making foolish choices because they value livestock over their own lives. Is that what you want? To leave? I don't know. She looked at him, and her eyes were bright with something that might have been tears. I don't know what I want anymore. He should let her go. Should tell her she was right, that this life was too hard and too dangerous and she deserved better. Should make it easy for her to walk away. But instead he heard himself say, I don't want you to go. Lydia's breath caught. Don't say that. Why not? It's true. Because it makes this harder. Because I was supposed to spend a month proving I could survive here, and instead She stopped, shaking her head. This wasn't supposed to happen. What wasn't? This. She gestured between them helplessly. Caring, worrying, feeling like if something happened to you, She trailed off. Caleb closed the distance between them. Close enough now to see her face clearly in the lamplight, to see the fear and confusion, and something else he was afraid to name. I don't know what I'm doing, he said. I thought I wanted someone to help with the work, someone to make this place less lonely. But you're not what I expected. You're better, stronger. And yeah, that scares me too. Why? Because losing you would hurt, and I swore I wouldn't let myself hurt like that again. They stood there in the cold barn, two people who'd both lost too much trying to figure out if they were brave enough to risk losing more. The month isn't over yet, Lydia said finally. No, it's not. 3 more days. 3 more days. And then we decide. And then we decide. She nodded slowly, then turned and walked back to the house, her footprints dark in the fresh snow. Caleb stood alone in the barn for a long time, listening to his heart pound and trying to understand what had just happened. 3 days. Then everything would change. He just didn't know yet if it would change for better or worse. The next morning arrived gray and threatening, the sky pressing down like a lid on a pot ready to boil over. Caleb woke to silence, not the good kind that meant peace, but the heavy quiet that came before something broke. He found Lydia already in the kitchen, moving through her routine with mechanical precision. Coffee. Breakfast. No conversation. When she set his plate down, she didn't meet his eyes. Storm coming, he said just to break the silence. I can see that. Big one by the look of it. Yes. She sat down across from him with her own breakfast and they ate without speaking. The tension from last night still hung between them, thick enough to choke on. Caleb pushed his plate away, half finished. We need to talk about what happened. Do we? You know we do. Lydia set down her fork carefully. What would you like me to say, Mr. Boone? That I overreacted? That I was foolish to worry about a cracked beam? I want you to say what you meant. Last night, in the barn, you said caring wasn't supposed to happen. She was quiet for a long moment, her hands folded in front of her. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but strained. I came here with very specific expectations, a business arrangement, a partnership built on practical needs, not emotional ones. Somewhere along the way that changed, and I don't know what to do with it. Neither do I. Then we're both lost. Maybe. He leaned forward. Or maybe we stop pretending this is just business and admit what it's actually become. And what has it become? The question hung there, demanding an answer Caleb wasn't sure he could give. What had it become? More than a mail-order arrangement, that was certain. More than convenience. But love? He'd loved Sarah once, in the easy way young people loved when everything still seemed possible. This was different, harder, built on work and honesty and the slow revelation of character through shared struggle. I don't know what to call it, he said finally, but I know I don't want you to leave. That's not enough. What do you want me to say? I want you to tell me why. She looked at him directly now, her gray eyes demanding truth. Not because I'm useful. Not because I can cook and clean and help with the work. Why do you want me to stay? Caleb felt the words stick in his throat. He'd spent 12 years alone, 12 years building walls around anything that might hurt him. Opening those walls felt like stepping off a cliff. Because when you're here, the house doesn't feel empty, he said quietly. Because you see things I've stopped noticing. Because you don't let me get away with half measures or excuses. He paused. Because I wake up and the first thing I think about is whether you're all right, whether you slept well, whether you're warm enough. Lydia's expression softened fractionally. That's caring. I know. I told you I didn't come here for that. I know that too. And yet here we are. Here we are. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. The sky had darkened to the color of old iron. "The storm's almost here," Lydia said, standing. "We should secure everything before it hits." It wasn't an answer to the question hanging between them, but it was all she could give right now. Caleb understood that. Some conversations took time to finish. They spent the next 2 hours preparing for what was coming. Caleb brought in extra firewood while Lydia filled every container they had with water. They moved the chickens into the barn, secured the shutters, checked and double-checked that everything that could blow away was tied down or brought inside. By noon, the first flakes were falling. By 2, the world had disappeared into white. This wasn't like the storm a week ago. This was bigger, meaner, the kind of weather that killed cattle and collapsed roofs and reminded you how small and fragile human things were against the indifference of nature. They stayed inside, feeding the stove and watching the snow pile up against the windows. The temperature inside the house dropped steadily despite their efforts. Ice formed on the inside of the glass. Their breath came out in clouds. "How long will it last?" Lydia asked, pulling a blanket around her shoulders. "Could be hours, could be days." Caleb added another log to the fire. "We've got enough wood for 3 days if we're careful, food for longer." "And the animals?" "Barn's solid. They'll be cold, but they'll survive." Lydia nodded, but he could see the worry in her face. Not for herself, for the stock, for the ranch, for all the things that could go wrong in weather like this. As afternoon bled into evening, the storm intensified. Wind screamed around the house like something alive and furious. Snow didn't fall so much as fly horizontal, driven by gusts that shook the walls. The world beyond the windows was nothing but white chaos. They ate a cold dinner, bread and cheese and dried apples, because cooking would waste heat they couldn't afford to lose. Afterward, they sat close to the stove, wrapped in blankets, listening to the violence outside. "Tell me something," Lydia said eventually. "Like what?" "Anything. I need to think about something other than that wind." Caleb thought for a moment. "When I first came out here, I was 26, full of ideas about making something of myself, building an empire." He shook his head. "I was an idiot." "Why?" "Because empire building takes money I didn't have and luck I've never had. First year I lost half my cattle to wolves. Second year drought killed the grass and I had to sell the rest just to buy seed. Third year," he stopped. "Third year Sarah died and I realized I'd brought her to this place for nothing. All my big plans, all my dreams, and I couldn't even keep my wife and daughter alive." "That wasn't your fault, wasn't it? I'm the one who insisted on coming out here. I'm the one who said we'd build something great." His voice had gone bitter. "She wanted to go back to St. Louis after the first winter. I told her to give it time, that it would get better." "Did it?" "No, it got worse. And then she was gone." Well, Lydia was quiet for a long time. The fire crackled, the wind howled. "Thomas wanted children," she said finally. "I couldn't give them to him. Tried for years. Lost 3 before they were even real enough to bury. And after that, nothing. The doctor said it was my constitution, that some women weren't made for it." She pulled the blanket tighter. "He never blamed me. Not once. But I blamed myself every time I saw him looking at other people's children. Every time someone asked when we'd be starting a family. That wasn't your fault either, wasn't it? My body, my failure." "That's not how it works." "Isn't it?" She looked at him. "You blame yourself for Sarah dying of fever. I blame myself for not giving Thomas the family he wanted. We're both carrying guilt for things we couldn't control." Caleb had never thought about it that way. But she was right. They were both weighted down by the past, by choices and chances that had shaped them into people who'd learned not to hope for too much. "So what do we do?" he asked. "I don't know. Forgive ourselves, maybe, or at least stop punishing ourselves for being human." "That easy, huh?" "No." She smiled slightly. "Not easy at all, but necessary." The temperature continued to drop as night came on. They moved closer to the stove, sharing blankets now because there was no point in pretending pride mattered more than warmth. Caleb could feel Lydia shivering beside him despite the layers. "Come here," he said, opening the blanket. She hesitated only a moment before moving closer, letting him wrap the wool around both of them, her back pressed against his chest, her head just below his chin. She was cold, trembling, but solid and real in a way that made his heart clench. "Better?" he asked. "Better?" They sat like that as the storm raged outside. sharing heat and silence. Caleb couldn't remember the last time he'd been this close to another person. It felt strange and right and terrifying all at once. "Mr. Boone?" Lydia's voice was quiet. "Yeah? If I stay, and I'm not saying I will, but if I do, what would that look like? Practically speaking." He thought about it. "We'd build more. Add to the herd when we can afford it. Maybe put in a garden come spring. You could grow vegetables, herbs, whatever you wanted. We'd keep working the ranch together, keep building." "Just working? What else?" She was quiet for a moment. "I'm 47 years old. I'm not a girl who dreams about romance or fairy tales. But I'm also not a housekeeper you're paying in room and board. If I stay, I need to know what you expect from me." Caleb felt heat climb his neck. They'd been dancing around this question since she arrived. The practical reality of two people sharing a house, sharing a life. The expectations that came with marriage, even a marriage of convenience. "I expect honesty," he said carefully. "I expect you to pull your weight and not quit when things get hard. I expect you to tell me when something's wrong instead of letting it fester." He paused. "Everything else, that's between us to figure out. At whatever pace makes sense." "That's very diplomatic." "I'm trying to be respectful." "I know." She shifted slightly, turning so she could see his face. "But respect and honesty aren't the same thing. So let me ask directly, do you want a wife, Caleb? Or a business partner you happen to live with?" The use of his first name caught him off guard. She'd never called him anything but Mr. Boone. "I don't know," he admitted. "I thought I wanted one thing when I sent that advertisement. Now I'm not sure what I want, except you. Here. However that looks." "That's not very clear." "No, it's not. But it's true." Lydia studied his face for a long moment. Then she turned back around, settling against him again. "All right, that's something, at least." They fell silent, and eventually Caleb felt her breathing slow and deepen as she drifted towards sleep. He stayed awake, listening to the storm and trying to figure out what he'd just promised. Sometime after midnight, he heard it. A sound that didn't belong. Not wind, not snow, but something else. A cracking noise, sharp and wrong. He was on his feet before he fully understood why, Lydia jerking awake beside him. "What is it?" she asked, still foggy with sleep. "I don't know. Stay here." He grabbed the lamp and his coat and went outside into the full fury of the storm. The cold hit him like a physical blow, snow stinging his face, wind trying to knock him sideways. He could barely see 3 feet in front of him. The sound came again, a groaning crack from the direction of the barn. Caleb fought his way through drifts that were already waist-deep, the lamp swinging wildly in his hand. When he reached the barn, he saw the problem immediately. The weight of the snow had collapsed part of the roof on the north side. Not the section they'd braced, but farther down, over the feed storage. And worse, the collapse had started a fire. A lantern must have fallen when the beam gave way, and now flames were licking up the dry timber despite the snow pouring in through the hole. "No, no, no, no!" He threw open the barn door and was met with smoke and the terrified sounds of animals. The horses were screaming, throwing themselves against their stalls. The cow was bellowing. The chickens were a chaos of noise. Caleb plunged into the smoke, his eyes immediately streaming. He had to get the animals out before the whole structure went up. A hand grabbed his arm, jerking him backward. Lydia stood there in the doorway, her shawl already dusted with snow, her face set in grim determination. "What are you doing?" he shouted over the noise. "Helping! Tell me what to do!" "Get back to the house!" "No, tell me what to do!" There wasn't time to argue. The fire was spreading, eating through the dry wood faster than the snow could dampen it. "The horses first," he said. "Get them out and turn them loose. They'll find shelter." She nodded and disappeared into the smoke. Caleb went for the cow, fumbling with the latch on her pen. Bessie was wild-eyed with fear, but she knew him, trusted him. He got a rope around her neck and dragged her toward the door, her hooves slipping on the floor. Outside, he could see Lydia leading the first horse out, her small form dwarfed by the animal's bulk. She was coughing, her face streaked with soot, but she didn't hesitate. Just slapped the horse's rump and sent it running into the storm before turning back for the next one. They worked without speaking, moving in and out of the burning barn in a rhythm born of pure necessity. The horses, the cow, the chickens in their crates, carried out 2 at a time and set in the lee of the house, where they'd be protected from the worst of the wind. By the time they got the last animal out, the fire had taken most of the north wall. Flames reached up into the night sky, bright and terrible against the white of the storm. Caleb stood there panting, covered in ash and soot, watching everything burn. The barn, the feed, the equipment stored inside, all of it going up in smoke. 12 years of work, gone. He felt Lydia's hand on his arm. "We have to get back inside. You're freezing." "The barn is lost, but we're alive and so are the animals. Come on." She pulled him toward the house and he let her, too numb to resist. Inside, she pushed him into a chair and started peeling off his wet coat, his boots. Her hands were shaking, from cold or shock or both, but she didn't stop moving. "You're in shock," she said. "We need to get you warm. The livestock will survive the night. Horses are tough. Bessie, too. The chickens are sheltered." She wrapped blankets around him, then knelt in front of the stove and built up the fire with quick, efficient movements. "We'll figure out the rest in the morning." Caleb stared at the flames in the stove, seeing instead the flames devouring his barn. All that work, all those years. And for what? So it could all burn down in a single night? "I'm ruined," he said quietly. "You're not. The barn's gone, the feed's gone. How am I supposed to keep the animals alive through winter without shelter or food?" "We'll rebuild." He laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "With what? I don't have money for lumber. Don't have time to rebuild before the worst of winter hits. Don't have—" He stopped, the weight of it crushing down on him. "I've got nothing." Lydia was quiet for a long moment. Then she stood and disappeared into her room. When she came back, she was holding a small leather pouch. "What's that?" he asked. She opened it and poured the contents onto the table. Banknotes. Not a lot, but enough to make his breath catch. "My savings," she said. "Everything I have left from selling Thomas's books and our furniture. I was keeping it for, I don't know, emergency. Future." She pushed it toward him. "Take it, buy lumber, buy feed, rebuild." Caleb stared at the money. "I can't take this." "Why not?" "Because it's yours. Because you'll need it if—" He stopped. "If I leave?" She sat down across from him. "I'm not leaving, Caleb." "You don't know that. The month isn't over. The month doesn't matter anymore." She reached across the table and took his hand. "I'm not leaving. Not tomorrow. Not next week. Not ever. I'm staying. If you'll have me." He looked at her. Really looked. Her face was streaked with soot and tears. He hadn't seen her cry. Her hair had come loose and hung around her shoulders in tangles. She was shaking with cold and exhaustion and probably fear. She was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. "Why?" he asked. "After everything tonight, the fire, the danger, the loss, why would you choose to stay?" "Because this is the first place I felt like I belonged in 3 years. Because you need me, and I need to be needed. Because—" She stopped, then said it anyway. "Because I care what happens to you, and to this ranch, and to everything we've built together." She squeezed his hand. "That's not going to change just because a barn burned down." Caleb felt something break open in his chest, something that had been locked tight since Sarah died, since Emma died, since he'd learned that loving people meant risking the kind of pain that could destroy you. "I'm not good at this," he said roughly. "At what?" "Letting people in. Trusting that they won't leave." "I know. Neither am I." She smiled slightly. "But maybe we can be bad at it together." He stood and pulled her up with him, wrapping his arms around her before he could think better of it. She came willingly, pressing her face against his chest, her arms going around his waist. They stood like that for a long time, holding each other while the storm raged outside and the ruins of the barn smoldered in the distance. It wasn't romantic, it wasn't perfect. They were both filthy and exhausted and scared about what morning would bring. But it was real. And right now, that was enough. When they finally pulled apart, Lydia looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes. "We should sleep. Morning will come whether we're ready or not." "Yeah." But neither of them moved. They stood there in the firelight, the space between them charged with everything they'd said and everything they hadn't. "Lydia," Caleb said quietly, Yes? Thank you. For tonight. For staying. For everything. You don't have to thank me. I do. Because you didn't have to risk yourself out there. You could have stayed safe in the house. No, I couldn't. That's what you still don't understand. She reached up and touched his face, her palm cold against his cheek. Where you go, I go. That's what partnership means. He turned his head and kissed her palm, a brief, impulsive gesture that surprised them both. When he looked at her again, something had shifted in her expression. Caleb, I know, too much, too fast. No, she shook her head. Not too much, just unexpected. Good unexpected or bad unexpected? I'm not sure yet. But she was smiling slightly. Ask me again in the morning. They separated finally, heading to their respective rooms. But at her doorway, Lydia paused and looked back. The month is over tomorrow, she said. I know. We don't need to wait. I'm staying. If the offer still stands. It stands. Then it's settled. She hesitated, then added, We'll figure out the rest as we go. The rest? What this is, what we are to each other, all of it. She met his eyes. But we'll figure it out together. Agreed? Agreed. She disappeared into her room and closed the door. Caleb stood alone in the main room, listening to the wind and the crackling fire and the pounding of his own heart. The barn was gone. Winter was here. They had a hard road ahead of them. But Lydia was staying, and somehow that made everything else feel possible. Morning came too soon and not soon enough. Caleb woke to pale light filtering through the window and the eerie silence that follows a storm. For a moment, he lay there hoping the previous night had been a nightmare. Then he smelled the lingering smoke in his clothes and knew better. He found Lydia already up, standing at the window with a cup of coffee, looking out at the devastation. The barn was a blackened skeleton. What the fire hadn't consumed, the storm had battered. Charred timbers jutted up from the snow like broken bones, and everything else was buried under drifts that had piled up against the ruins in grotesque waves. How bad? He asked, coming to stand beside her. Bad. She handed him the coffee without looking away from the window. But not impossible. They dressed in layers and went outside together into air so cold it hurt to breathe. The world was white and still, the storm having blown itself out sometime before dawn. In the distance, Caleb could see the horses huddled together in the lee of a rocky outcrop. Bessie was with them, her dark shape unmistakable against the snow. The chickens were alive too, huddled in their crates where they'd left them, looking miserable but intact. First thing is shelter, Caleb said, surveying the damage. Animals can't make it through another night like last night without protection. What about the lean-to? Too small, but we could clear it out, expand it temporarily. It won't be pretty, but it'll keep them from freezing. Then let's start there. They worked through the morning in brutal cold, clearing snow from the lean-to and reinforcing the walls with whatever salvageable lumber they could pull from the barn ruins. It was grim, exhausting work. Every board Caleb touched reminded him of what he'd lost. Hours of labor, years of accumulated resources, all gone in a single night. But Lydia worked beside him without complaint, her breath coming out in clouds, her hands red and raw despite the gloves. She didn't talk about the money she'd offered last night, didn't mention staying or leaving or any of the fragile promises they'd made. She just worked. By midday, they had a crude shelter that would at least keep the wind off the animals. They brought the horses in one at a time, along with Bessie and the chickens, settling them into the cramped space. It wasn't good, but it would have to do. Now what? Lydia asked when they finally stopped to eat, cold biscuits and the last of the cheese eaten standing up in the house. Now we figure out if we can salvage anything from the barn. Feed, tools, anything useful. He paused. And then I need to go into town, get lumber and supplies to rebuild properly. With my money, I'll pay you back. I don't want you to pay me back. She set down her biscuit. That's not how this works. Then how does it work? It's our money now, our ranch, our problems and our solutions. She met his eyes steadily. Unless you're still thinking of this as yours and mine instead of ours. The word ours settled between them like a promise and a challenge. You're right, Caleb said after a moment. Our money, our ranch. Good. Then stop acting like you're alone in this. They spent the afternoon picking through the barn ruins, salvaging what they could. Most of the feed was ruined, either burned or soaked through, but they found some tools that had survived. A few bags of grain that had been protected by their placement. Not much, but something. As they worked, Caleb kept glancing at Lydia. She was covered in soot and ash, her dress ruined, her face showing the exhaustion of a sleepless night and hard labor. But she didn't slow down, didn't ask to rest, didn't once suggest that maybe this was all too much. "Why are you staring at me?" she asked, without looking up from the pile of debris she was sorting. "I'm not staring." "You are. You've looked over here at least 6 times in the past 10 minutes. Despite everything, he almost smiled. "Just trying to figure you out." "Any luck?" "Not yet." She straightened, wiping her forehead with the back of her hand and leaving a streak of ash across her face. "I'm not that complicated, Caleb. I'm a widow who was tired of being alone, who wanted something to build instead of something to lose, that's all." "That's not all." "No," she admitted. "It's not. But it's all I know how to explain right now." They worked until the light began to fail, then trudged back to the house in silence. Caleb's entire body ached, and he could see the same exhaustion in the way Lydia moved. Slower now, every step an effort. Inside, she started to move toward the kitchen, but he stopped her. "Sit. I'll make dinner." "You don't need to. You've been working all day, same as me. Sit down before you collapse." For once, she didn't argue, just sank into a chair and closed her eyes. Caleb put together a simple meal from what they had left. Beans, the last of the bacon, cornbread he'd made 2 days ago and forgot about. It wasn't much, but it was hot, and when he set it in front of Lydia, she opened her eyes and gave him a tired smile. "Thank you. Don't mention it." They ate in silence for a while. Outside, darkness was falling fast, and the temperature was dropping again. Inside, the fire crackled and the walls creaked as the wood contracted in the cold. "Tomorrow I'll go to town," Caleb said eventually. "Get what we need to rebuild properly. Garrett might extend credit if I explain what happened. Or we use the money and don't go into debt." Lydia, "No." She set down her fork. "We're not starting this partnership by putting ourselves in debt when we have the means to avoid it. That's foolish, and we both know it." He wanted to argue, wanted to protect her savings, wanted to maintain some illusion that he could handle this alone. But she was right. Going into debt when they had cash was stupid pride talking, nothing more. "All right," he said, "we use the money." "Good. But we're keeping track. What we spend, what we rebuild. This ranch, it belongs to both of us now, equally." Lydia looked at him for a long moment. "Equally. I mean it. Not just the work, but the ownership. We'll draw up papers, make it legal. Half yours, half mine." "That's a significant offer." "It's not an offer. It's what's fair." He paused. "You've already put your money into it, your work, your everything. You've earned it." She reached across the table and took his hand. "Then yes, equal partners." They finished eating in a companionable silence that felt different from before, less uncertain, more settled. When they were done, Lydia stood to clear the dishes but swayed slightly, catching herself on the table. Caleb was on his feet immediately. "You all right?" "Fine, just tired." "You're past tired. You're about to drop." He guided her toward her room. "Go to bed. I'll clean up." "But no arguments. You've been up since before dawn, working harder than anyone should. Sleep." She looked like she wanted to protest, but exhaustion won. "All right, but wake me if you need anything." "I won't need anything. Go." He watched her disappear into her room, then stood alone in the main room, listening to the fire and thinking about everything that had changed in 24 hours. Yesterday morning, they'd still been dancing around what this arrangement actually was. Now they were partners, equal owners, building something together. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, it felt right. The next morning dawned clear and painfully bright, the sun reflecting off the snow with enough force to make your eyes water. Caleb loaded the wagon while Lydia made breakfast, and by the time the sun was fully up, they were ready to go. "You should stay here," Caleb said. "Rest. I can handle the town." "No. Lydia, we're partners now. That means I go where you go. Besides," she climbed up onto the wagon seat, "if we're spending my money, I want to say in what we buy." He couldn't argue with that logic, so he didn't try. The ride into town was slow, the road buried under snow that had drifted deep in places. They passed two other ranches along the way. Both looked as battered by the storm as Caleb's place, though he didn't see any sign of fire damage. When they reached town, it was busier than usual. People gathered in small groups, talking in low voices, surveying damage. The saloon had lost part of its roof. The land office had a window blown out. Everyone looked tired and worried. Garrett was sweeping snow from the front of the trading post when they pulled up. He looked up, his expression shifting from weary to surprised when he saw them both. "Caleb, Mrs. Hale." He leaned on his broom. "Heard you lost your barn." News traveled fast, even in storms. "Where'd you hear that?" "Dutch Morrison came through yesterday afternoon. Said he saw smoke from your place during the storm." Garrett's eyes were sympathetic. "I'm sorry, that's rough. We'll rebuild." Caleb climbed down from the wagon. "That's why we're here. Need lumber, nails, everything. That'll cost." "I know." He glanced at Lydia, who nodded. "We've got cash." Garrett's eyebrows rose slightly, but he didn't comment. "All right, come inside and we'll figure out what you need." They spent the next hour going through inventory, calculating amounts, tallying costs. The total came to more than Caleb had hoped, but less than he'd feared. When they were done, Lydia counted out the money without hesitation, handing it over like it meant nothing more than buying flour. "You folks want this delivered?" Garrett asked. "We'll take what fits in the wagon today. Rest can come out tomorrow if that works." "I'll have it ready by noon." As they were leaving, Margaret Fletcher appeared in the doorway, blocking their exit. Her eyes went from Caleb to Lydia and back again, sharp with curiosity. "Caleb, Mrs. Hale, I heard about the fire. What a tragedy." "We're managing," Caleb said shortly. "I'm sure you are. But still, losing your barn like that, in the middle of winter, it must be devastating." She paused delicately. "I suppose this means Mrs. Hale will be returning east? Surely you can't expect her to stay through a Montana winter with no proper shelter for the animals." Lydia stepped forward before Caleb could respond. "On the contrary, Mrs. Fletcher, I'm not going anywhere. We're rebuilding, together." "Together." Margaret's tone made the word sound vaguely scandalous. "How ambitious." "It's practical," Lydia said evenly. "I've invested in this ranch, my time, my money, my labor. I'm not about to abandon that investment because of one setback." "Your money?" Margaret's eyes widened. "You mean you're actually equal partners?" Caleb interrupted. "Mrs. Hale owns half the ranch, legal and binding." The shock on Margaret's face would have been funny under other circumstances. "But that's highly irregular. A woman owning property is perfectly legal," Lydia said, "and in this case, well-deserved. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have work to do." She walked past Margaret with her head high, leaving the older woman sputtering. Caleb followed, fighting the urge to grin. Outside, he helped Lydia back onto the wagon. That was something. That was necessary. Women like Margaret Fletcher need to understand that the world is changing, whether they approve or not. "You enjoyed that." "Perhaps a little," she smiled. "Is it wrong that I did?" "Not even slightly." They loaded the wagon with the first batch of supplies and headed back to the ranch. The sun was high now, melting the top layer of snow and turning the road to mud. By the time they made it home, they were both exhausted again. But there was something energizing about having a plan, about knowing what came next. They spent the rest of the day unloading supplies and beginning the actual work of rebuilding. Caleb laid out where the new barn would go, same footprint as the old one, but with modifications. Stronger beams, better ventilation, a separate section for feed storage that could be sealed off if fire ever threatened again. Lydia worked beside him, measuring and marking, asking questions about why certain choices made sense. She was learning the logic of construction the same way she'd learned everything else, quickly, thoroughly, filing information away for future use. "Why put the feed storage here instead of there?" she asked at one point, pointing to his sketch. "Further from the stalls means if there's fire, we have more time to get the animals out. And this wall," he tapped the drawing, "will be double thickness, harder for fire to spread through." "You're thinking about what went wrong." "Have to. Can't afford to make the same mistakes twice." She nodded slowly. That's wise. That's survival. They worked until dark, then retreated to the house for a simple dinner. Over the next week, they fell into a rhythm that felt almost normal despite the abnormality of their situation. Every morning, they'd wake early, tend to the animals in their makeshift shelter, eat quickly, then spend the day working on the new barn. Every evening, they'd come inside exhausted, eat dinner, and fall asleep almost immediately. It was brutal work. The cold made everything harder. Lumber that would have been easy to handle in summer became unwieldy when your fingers were numb. Nails slipped. Measurements had to be rechecked constantly because metal contracted in the cold and threw everything off. But slowly, the barn began to take shape. The foundation posts went in first, driven deep into ground that had to be broken with picks because it was frozen solid. Then the floor beams, the wall frames, the roof structure. Each piece was a small victory against the disaster that had taken the first barn. Other ranchers started showing up to help. Dutch Morrison came first, appearing one morning with his 2 sons and a wagon full of extra lumber. "Heard you were rebuilding," he said simply. "Figured you could use help." Caleb wanted to refuse, pride demanding that he handle this himself, but Lydia stepped in before he could speak. "We'd be grateful," she said. "Thank you." Dutch's sons worked for 3 days straight, helping to raise the heavy roof beams that would have taken Caleb and Lydia a week to manage alone. Other neighbors followed, men who'd barely spoken to Caleb in years, who showed up with tools and time and the unspoken understanding that when disaster hit, you helped, because next time it might be your barn burning. Lydia fed them all, stretching their dwindling supplies to make meals for a dozen men. She managed it somehow, soup that seemed to multiply, bread that appeared from nowhere, coffee that stayed hot and strong no matter how many cups were poured. "You're a miracle worker," Dutch's wife said one afternoon, helping Lydia clean up after the midday meal. "I'm practical," Lydia corrected. "There's a difference." "Still, not many women could handle what you're handling, especially at your—" She stopped, flustered. "At my age?" Lydia smiled. "I'm 47, Mrs. Morrison, not ancient." "I didn't mean—" "I know what you meant, and you're not wrong to wonder, but I've learned that age matters less than determination. I'm determined to make this work." She looked out at where Caleb was working with the other men, his shirt sleeves rolled up despite the cold. "We both are." Mrs. Morrison followed her gaze. "He's different since you came. Lighter, somehow." "Is he?" "Used to be he'd barely say 2 words when he came to town. Now he actually talks. Smiles even." She paused. "You're good for him." "I hope so," Lydia said quietly. "I'm certainly trying to be." By the end of the 3rd week, the barn was finished. Not just functional, actually finished. Walls, roof, doors that hung straight, stalls for the horses, a pen for Bessie, a protected area for the chickens. It was better than the old barn had been, stronger, built with the kind of care that comes from learning through loss. The day they moved the animals in, half the county showed up. Not to help, the work was done, but to see, to witness, to mark the moment when Caleb Boone's ranch came back from disaster. Dutch brought whiskey. Someone else brought a fiddle. By evening, there was a celebration happening in the new barn. People dancing between the stalls, music echoing off the fresh-cut walls, laughter mixing with the warm smell of hay and horses. Caleb found Lydia standing in the doorway, watching it all with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You all right?" he asked. "Yes. Just taking it in." She turned to look at him. "We did this, you and I. We actually did this. We had help. We did. But we started it. We kept going when it seemed impossible. And now," she gestured at the barn, at the people, at everything they'd built. "Now we have this." Someone called Caleb's name, asking him to settle a dispute about who'd nailed the most boards. He was about to respond when Lydia caught his hand. "Dance with me first," she said. "I don't dance." "Neither do I, so we'll be terrible together." She pulled him into the center of the barn before he could protest. The fiddler saw them and shifted to something slower, sweeter. Around them, other couples were moving in the simple patterns of a frontier dance, nothing fancy, just swaying and turning in time with the music. Caleb put his hand on Lydia's waist, feeling awkward and exposed. I really don't know what I'm doing. Then we're perfectly matched. She put her hand on his shoulder. Just move, don't think about it. They swayed together, off rhythm and graceless. But it didn't matter. Around them, people were smiling and talking and celebrating, but Caleb was only aware of Lydia, the weight of her hand in his, the way she fit against him, the small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Thank you, he said quietly. For what? For staying, for believing this was possible, for everything. You don't need to thank me. I do, because I couldn't have done this without you. Wouldn't have even tried. She looked up at him, and her eyes were bright with something that might have been tears. Yes, you would have. You're stronger than you think, Caleb Boone. So are you, Lydia Hale. Not Hale anymore, she said. We should probably do something about that. His heart stuttered. What do you mean? I mean we own this ranch together. We've built this life together. We're partners in every way that matters. Us, she paused. Except one. Lydia, I'm not asking for romance or grand gestures. I'm 47 years old and you're 43, and we're both too practical for that nonsense. But I'm asking for commitment. Legal, binding, permanent commitment. She met his eyes steadily. I'm asking you to marry me, Caleb. Actually marry me. Not just let me stay, but choose me. Choose this. Choose us. The music swirled around them. People laughed. The barn, their barn, stood solid and real, proof that broken things could be rebuilt. I'm not easy to live with, Caleb said. Neither am I. I'm stubborn, and I don't talk about my feelings, and sometimes I make stupid decisions. Like risking your life to save a barn? Exactly like that. Then I suppose I'll have to keep risking mine to pull you back from the edge. She smiled. Does that mean yes? That means yes. He pulled her closer, not caring anymore who saw. That means I choose you. I choose us. I choose all of it. Then kiss me, she said, before I lose my nerve and remember I'm supposed to be dignified. So he did. Right there in the middle of the barn, in front of half the county, he kissed Lydia Hale like she was the only thing in the world that mattered. Because she was. The celebration went late into the night, but eventually people drifted home, taking their music and whiskey and well wishes with them. Dutch was the last to leave, clapping Caleb on the shoulder as he headed for his wagon. You did good, he said. Both of you. When everyone was finally gone, Caleb and Lydia stood alone in the barn, looking at what they'd built. It's a good barn, Lydia said. It is. We should probably build a chicken coop next. Can't keep them in here forever. Probably. And the house could use some work. The roof needs patching, and that window in the kitchen doesn't close properly. All true. She turned to look at him. Are you actually listening, or are you just agreeing with everything I say? Little bit of both. She laughed and took his hand. Come on, it's late and we have work tomorrow. We always have work tomorrow. That's ranch life. She started toward the house, pulling him with her. But at least now we're doing it together. Inside, the house was warm from the fire she'd banked before the celebration. They moved through the evening routine automatically now, checking the stove, setting out coffee for morning, making sure everything was secure for the night. At her bedroom door, Lydia paused. About what I said earlier, about getting married properly. What about it? I meant it, but we don't have to rush. We can wait until spring, until things settle. No. Caleb stepped closer. I don't want to wait. We'll go into town next week, talk to whoever handles these things. Make it legal and binding. You're sure? I've never been more sure of anything. She reached up and touched his face, her palm warm against his cheek. I never thought I'd have this again. A home. A partner. Someone who sees me as I am and wants me anyway. Same, he said roughly. I thought that part of my life was over, that I'd just work until I couldn't anymore, and then... He shrugged. And then what? I don't know. Die alone, I guess. Leave this place to whoever wanted it. Well, you're not dying alone. You're stuck with me now. Good. They stood there in the doorway, neither one willing to step away first. Finally, Lydia smiled. Good night, Caleb. Good night. But as she started to close the door, he stopped her. Lydia? Yes? Move your things into my room, the big bedroom. Our bedroom. Her breath caught. Are you sure? You're going to be my wife. We're building a life together. Seems foolish to keep sleeping in separate rooms while we wait for some preacher to say words over us. That's very practical of you. I'm a practical man. Yes, she said softly. You are. She moved her things that night, not much, just what she needed. The rest could wait for morning. When she was settled, they lay in the darkness, listening to the wind and the house creaking and the comfortable sounds of a place that was finally, truly home. Caleb? Lydia's voice came quiet in the dark. Yeah? Thank you for taking a chance on me. Thank you for taking a chance on this place. On me. We took a chance on each other, she corrected, and it worked. Yeah, he said, pulling her closer. It did. Spring came late that year, winter holding on with stubborn determination well into April. But when it finally arrived, it came with a rush, snow melting, grass greening, the whole world waking up after months of cold. Caleb and Lydia stood on the porch one morning in early May, watching the sun rise over land that was finally, truly theirs. They'd been married for 2 months now, a simple ceremony in town with Dutch and his wife as witnesses. Nothing fancy, but legal and binding, just like Lydia had wanted. The ranch looked different now. The new barn stood solid against the sky. There was a proper chicken coop, a vegetable garden that Lydia had started, a second corral for the new calves that had been born over the winter. Everything still rough around the edges, still clearly a work in progress, but unmistakably alive. I was thinking, Lydia said, leaning against the porch rail. About? Expanding the house, adding another room or two. Caleb looked at her sideways. We've got 2 bedrooms. How many rooms do we need? Well, we might not need them now, but eventually. She paused, then said it plainly. I'd like to try for children, Caleb. I know I'm not young. I know the chances are small, but I'd like to try. He was quiet for a long moment. You said you couldn't. I said I'd lost 3, and after that, nothing, but that was with Thomas. Maybe it was him. Maybe it was me. Maybe it was both of us together. She turned to face him. Or maybe I'm being foolish, hoping for something that won't happen. But either way, I'd like the space. For children if we're blessed. For other things if we're not. Caleb thought about it. About the possibility of life filling these empty spaces. About teaching a child to ride or build or understand this hard land. It terrified him. But it also felt right. All right, he said. We'll build more rooms. Just like that? Just like that. She smiled and took his hand. Have I told you lately that you're a good man? Not in the last few hours. Well, you are. Stubborn and infuriating sometimes, but good. Right back at you, except for the man part. She laughed and leaned against him, and they stood there watching the sun climb higher, warming the land that had taken so much from both of them, but had also given them this, each other, a home, a future that felt possible again. You know what people in town say about us? Lydia asked. I can imagine. They say we're proof that it's never too late, that even after loss, even after grief, you can build something new. She paused. They call me the widow who wouldn't quit. That's accurate. And they call you the rancher who learned to hope again. That's sentimental. That's true. She looked up at him. You did, learn to hope. I can see it in the way you look at this place now, like it's worth fighting for. It is worth fighting for. He kissed the top of her head. You made it worth fighting for. They stood there until the sun was fully up and the day's work was calling. There was fence to mend, cattle to check, a garden to tend. All the endless tasks of a working ranch, all the proof that they were building something that would last. As they walked toward the barn together, Caleb thought about the advertisement he'd put in that paper almost 6 months ago. He'd been looking for someone to help with the work, someone to make his life easier. He'd expected someone young and grateful and easy to manage. Instead, he'd gotten Lydia, a woman who challenged him, matched him, refused to let him settle for less than what was possible. A woman who'd taken his half-dead ranch and helped breathe life back into it, not through magic or luck, but through sheer stubborn determination. She wasn't what he'd wanted. She was better. And as they worked together in the morning light, Caleb realized that sometimes the best things in life were the ones you never thought to ask for. The ones that arrived unexpected and stayed through sheer force of will. The ones that proved, against all odds, that even on the hard frontier where everything seemed designed to break you, love could take root and grow. Not the easy love of youth, all passion and poetry, but the hard-won love of people who'd lost everything and chosen to build again anyway, together.